We talk a lot about video games that I experience, but what if we took a second to stand back and look at gaming history from a different perspective by looking at the first 30 NES games ever released? I'm excited to talk about this, and I'm sure many of you have heard of every single game that's going to be mentioned here today. Now, a majority of these games I'm going to talk about today, they belonged to the Nintendo Black Box line of games. Called that because they have a black box. It was interesting. It had this unique aesthetic. Breaking it down, we see an enlarged picture of the sprite work used in the game for a majority of these. We see the name in bright and attractive colors, the system's name, and in the bottom there are two interesting aspects as well. The bottom left has the series that these games belong to, and in the bottom right, we have the original NES seal of quality, which is a circular black seal with saw teeth. And it says, "This seal is your assurance that Nintendo has approved and guaranteed the quality of this product." Eventually, this would change to the oval-shaped seal of quality, with a white background simply saying "Official Nintendo Seal of Quality," something that still is used to this day. But I don't take it seriously because even Dirty Harry has the seal of quality. With all that being said, let's begin our journey into the first 30 games ever created for the NES. Our first game was released on October 18th, 1985, which is also a date shared with the next 16 titles. These were all launch titles for the Nintendo Entertainment System. 10-Yard Fight is a football game, or more so an arcade football game. We won't be able to choose any plays, but we can still do everything that is expected to be in football. This game originated in the arcade courtesy of Irem in 1983, who was still riding the high of their very successful arcade game Moon Patrol a year prior. 10-Yard Fight was ported directly to the NES and Famicom in 1985. The two versions are slightly different, with the NES having more replayability as it supported 2 players. The Japanese version was only in arcade mode, fighting to get to the highest level of difficulty. One thing I do want to point out is that if you look at the box of 10-Yard Fight, you'll notice an asterisk. That's a subtle way of Nintendo saying that they didn't develop the game. You'll see this on 2 games from our list today, 10-Yard Fight and Kung Fu, both developed by Irem. Baseball is the first game on this list that originated on the Famicom and was provided to American audiences via the Nintendo Versus system. For any of you who haven't seen the System Shock episode about the NES, I talked about how the release of the NES in America was odd. It started off primarily in the arcades with the Nintendo Versus system. It was Nintendo's way of testing the waters to see if they could appeal to that market. And what better way to do it than with baseball? Shigeru Miyamoto said in an interview in 1983 that he personally really wanted there to be a baseball game for the Famicom. Honestly, there's not much to say about it except that it is a baseball game, and you could do everything you should be able to do in baseball. Hit the ball, pitch it, field it, the works. This is our first puzzle game for the NES, Clue Clue Land, an odd name that represents the sound of something rooting around, going around and around. We play as a balloon fish called Bubbles, and our objective is to grab poles and loop around finding these golden ingots. Bubbles isn't helpless though. We can use our sound waves to stun enemies that show up. This game did originate in the arcades, but it was ported to the NES courtesy of the Nintendo Versus system, which did offer an update, believe it or not, including a significant amount of different puzzles, as well as bosses. Duck Hunt, by itself mind you, a lot of people like myself experienced this for the first time as a part of a 2-in-1 cartridge with Super Mario Bros., but this is the standalone. It's also the first light gun title from Nintendo on a home programmable console. In the game we shoot ducks or clay pigeons depending on what you want to do, with variable difficulties, and a dog that makes fun of you if you lose. This game is important because in some ways, it's an homage to where Nintendo began in the arcades. In the 70s, Nintendo bought out old bowling alleys and created a laser clay shooting system, which is represented as the clay pigeon aspect of this game. What about the duck part? Well, they made an electro-optical game also in the 70s called Duck Hunt, and it worked with a very rudimentary firearm and a projector. Pretty nice callback, huh? Duck Hunt was first provided to US consumers in the arcades in 1984 on the Versus system, where you can actually shoot the dog. True story. Another cool thing is that while this game was developed by Nintendo, there was some help from Intelligent Systems, the folks who created the Fire Emblem franchise. Excitebike was Shigeru Miyamoto's take on the sport of motocross, and it's a side-scrolling racer where we drive a dirt bike and race to the finish. What makes it so unique is that we need to maintain the temperature of our bike, meaning we can't hold down the throttle or we'll overheat it. We also need to land squarely on the ground to avoid crashing or tumbling. It's a fairly easy game and a very approachable one for people of all ages. And if you do manage to get bored of it, you can edit your own racetracks and challenge either yourself or your friends for the best time. Excitebike started on the Nintendo Versus system and had 2 enhanced versions, only one of which was in the arcades. The other one was for the Famicom Disk System, which we'll talk about another day. It was also the first game in this list today to be created by 2 joint studios within Nintendo, Nintendo R&D 1 and Nintendo R&D 4. Golf is our first game from Nintendo R&D 2, the studio led by Masayuki Uemura, the guy who actually engineered the design of the NES. R&D 2 also enlisted the help of HAL Laboratory, the creators of Kirby. Maybe I'll go over the individual studios at some point, but right now, it's all about golf. Golf on the NES is impressive because it was one of the first golfing games to physically show you a power and accuracy bar, which is pretty cool because nowadays it's a required standard for golfing games since. Golf was released in the arcades under the Nintendo Versus line, but there was a unique version, Versus Ladies Golf. I've never played it though. This is an oddly specific game that has an oddly specific peripheral, Rob the Robot. Rob was essentially a light gun dressed up in a robot cosplay, and he would look at the screen and manipulate the game you were playing. The game we're talking about today is Gyromite, which utilized these spinning tops you would place in their respective trays, and Rob would move them. We control Hector in a puzzle platforming environment, collecting dynamite before the timer expires, and we need to rely on Rob to be our player too. He's going to raise and lower platforms because Mr. Hector, he never learned how to jump. It's a novelty game and one of 2 released in the Robot series. Supposedly there were supposed to be 4 more, but they never came to light. Fun fact, during the release of the NES Deluxe set, Gyromite and Duck Hunt were both pack-in games. Nowadays, however, this game can be pricey, with the Rob accessory also carrying a hefty price. Almost $600 together if you're lucky. People do scalp it. Another joint venture between Nintendo and Intelligent Systems, Hogan's Alley is a simple shooting game that was placed in the Nintendo Versus system based on the shooting range of the same name, Camp Perry in Ohio. 3 targets will pop up and we need to quickly react and shoot the bad guys while not shooting the good guys. If we mess up 10 times, game over. You might recognize the name of this game if you're a fan of the Super Smash Bros. Franchise, because Popo and Nana made their first appearance in Super Smash Bros. Melee, and people loved them. But long before they were swinging their hammers in mutual combat among other Nintendo IPs, they were in the Nintendo Versus arcade system breaking blocks and working their way up to recover their stolen vegetables. It's a very interesting game, and it seems to always keep you on your toes, because you never know what's going to come next, be it a falling icicle, an angry polar bear, or the elusive nitpicker. Originally known as Kung Fu Master in the arcades by the way of Irem, this is the second game to have an asterisk on the cover. Shigeru Miyamoto really enjoyed this game and personally directed the release of Kung Fu for the NES and Spartan X for the Famicom. In the game, we play as Thomas, who goes around kicking the shit out of everyone that walks his way, trying to save his girlfriend Sylvia. The port itself is rather impressive for what it is, as the arcade game maintained an 8-way joystick for its combat inputs. Obviously, the NES could not accommodate that, but as a port, it is nice. It's also very important. Kung Fu is considered by many to be the first brawler game, and it was even created by Takashi Nishiyama, who would go on to create Street Fighter before jumping ship to SNK to make Fatal Fury. It all started here for him. Pinball is an interesting game because it's pinball on the NES, but before it was pinball on the NES, it was a Game & Watch product. It started its NES lifespan in the Nintendo Versus system and maintains 2 modes of play. In the first mode, it's pinball, no more no less, and in the second mode, it plays a little bit more like Breakout. It was also developed jointly by Nintendo and HAL Labs, and for anyone who enjoys gaming history, you can kind of see the promising relationship between HAL and Nintendo blossoming as these novelty titles were pumped out. Soccer was solely developed by Intelligent Systems. It's the first game under the privy of Nintendo that actually wasn't developed by Nintendo at all, but Intelligent was in many ways a third-party developer for Nintendo. So under the guidance of Nintendo, Intelligent was allowed to flourish. And they did that by making a soccer game that includes 7 different countries: USA, Spain, France, Brazil, Japan, the UK, and West Germany. Soccer on the Versus system in particular was rather successful, but there were more Versus games out there that did a little bit better. Oh hey, it's the other Rob game. Nice. It's a rather complex one too. If you were a kid with a programming logic mind, this game was for you. Instead of working with spinning tops, Rob works with 5 different colored blocks. These blocks are moved in a way as dictated by the player who controls Hector. Hector will jump around a control panel, and whatever commands you compound, Rob will execute them, plain and simple. If you like programming or want to bring your kids a fun experience with rudimentary command stacking, this might be something for you to check out. It's kind of expensive though, but manageable. Around $150. To me, this is single-handedly the most important game to be released not only in the history of video gaming, but also for the NES. Sure, it was on the Nintendo Versus system, and sure, it was a pack-in game, but if we look at how the industry was from an economic standpoint, 1983 was a bad year for video games. The video game market had crashed, and consumer confidence in video gaming as a market, borderline non-existent in the United States. Mario changed that. Smooth scrolling graphics, wonderful controls, and a protagonist that to this date carries the accolade of being one of the best-selling games of all time. Mario was the catalyst to bringing back consumer confidence, and we owe a lot to Super Mario Bros. For doing that. I'm sure many of you have played this, but for those of you who haven't, we control Mario going through the Mushroom Kingdom, fighting Bowser's forces to rescue Princess Toadstool. We can get power-ups like the Mushroom, Fire Flower, and even a star that grants us temporary invincibility. Now, I will say the Versus system version of this, it's incredibly different. And honestly, I think I would like to do an episode talking about the difference between NES releases and the Versus systems versions. Let me know down below if that's something that you'd be interested in. Tennis is interesting. Not only was it a launch title for the NES, it was one of the first launch titles for the Famicom, which only had 3 during its initial run. Versus Tennis was a massively big boost to the NES when it was first released in the arcades, being more popular than Capcom's 1942, Irem's Kung Fu Master, and Atari's Marble Madness. It lost to other grossing titles like Track and Field, Karate Champ, and 10-Yard Fight, but according to the Playmeter magazine in 1984, it was the 6th highest performing arcade game period, with games like Punch-Out, Spy Hunter, Firefox, and Mach 3 beating it. At the end of the day, it's just tennis. Singles or doubles, your call. Wild Gunman saw its start much like Duck Hunt did in the arcades in the 70s as an electromechanical game created by Gunpei Yokoi, the same guy who created the Game Boy and the Wander Swan. It was an interesting concept too. It was a light gun connected to a projector screen, and it had an FMV video of a real gunfighter playing in front of you. This was translated to the NES game, which was a really fun little novelty shooting game. It was kind of ambitious too. While there wasn't any violence, you are actively shooting another human. Did you know Mario and Luigi were in another game other than Super Mario Bros? That's what Wrecking Crew is. We control them and we have to destroy objects with a hammer. There's walls that can be hammered down, pillars, ladders, barrels that you can't destroy, bombs. It's actually an interesting game. The only thing in this game that Mario can't do is jump, which provides an interesting aspect to this game's difficulty, as you need to kind of discern and plan for which objects you want to destroy. It reminds me a lot of King's Valley if you've played that on the MSX. Wrecking Crew was also on the Versus system, being the 13th highest grossing cabinet, and this was also the final game, released in the 17-game hard release on October 18th, 1985. The rest of these games, they were released in monthly intervals, starting in June of 1986. Nintendo made tons of arcade games, but for the most part, many of them were incredibly forgettable. That changed once Donkey Kong came into the picture. It was Shigeru Miyamoto's first game that he personally designed. Prior to that, he only did the artwork for 2 games, Sheriff and Space Firebird. Donkey Kong was his baby, and his baby became a man really quick. Donkey Kong alone is considered to be one of the greatest arcade games ever, and it was ported to 18 different platforms. We play as Jumpman, climbing up and dodging obstacles from a cracked out Donkey Kong. For those who care about the later era of Donkey Kong lore, this is Cranky Kong in his prime. True story. Our whole objective is to rescue Pauline, and the game loops infinitely. It's a great time waster. Obviously, this one started in the arcades prior to the Versus system, but it wasn't on the Versus system. Why? because the Versus system was a retrofit kit to the original Donkey Kong franchise cabinets. They have a monitor that's unique, using different voltage inputs than other monitors at the time. This is a solid game though. Donkey Kong Jr. is the sequel to Donkey Kong, and unlike the original game, the roles of villain and hero, they're swapped. In this game, Mario decides to kidnap Donkey Kong, and his son Donkey Kong Jr. goes to rescue him. By the way, in the new Mario movie, Cranky is the father of Donkey Kong, so rationally, we can deduce that the Donkey Kong in the film is Donkey Kong Jr., the father of the current Donkey Kong. We can jump around, grab vines pretty fluidly, and work our way to get the key next to Mario. And much like the original one, it loops infinitely. It's time for the oddball in the lineage of Donkey Kong 3. I've only ever played this like once, and it's very different from what we would expect from Donkey Kong in general. Mario is not even in this game. Stanley the Exterminator is. You see, Donkey Kong's been a menace after being captured by Mario, and he decides to go apeshit, literally, in Stanley's greenhouse, throwing bees, beetles, and other insects Stanley's way. Lucky for us, Stanley is an exterminator, and he proceeds to blast pesticides straight up Donkey Kong's thick ass! The original arcade cabinet wasn't that popular. In fact, it was viewed as a commercial failure, but it still managed to be one of the first NES games released. It's a simple game, but to me it doesn't really stand out. It's just a port of a failed Nintendo arcade title. Want to learn math with Donkey Kong Jr.? You can with Donkey Kong Math. And no, it's not going to be a good time. This game costs $200, so if you're going to buy it, you better learn math and learn to like it. This game was created by Nintendo and one of their lesser-known subsidiaries, SRD, or Systems Research and Development. For those of you who own a Labo, or a game builder garage, thank these guys for it. But give them a stern dad look for Donkey Kong Jr. Math. It's a straightforward game where solving arithmetic equations by grabbing the correct numbers and then landing on the appropriate island for the correct function. We have 8 more games to discuss this day, and I know that this has been a longer video, and for those who stuck around for it, thank you. It's not easy to jump to making occasional long-form products when you're kind of known for lists of 10 games. So I appreciate you for taking the time to stick around this long. You're awesome, and I love that you're a part of this community. It truly means a lot. Now this is a legacy game, Mario Brothers. Originally created as a spin-off of Donkey Kong in the arcades, it's a rather interesting game. We play as Mario and we jump up and knock over enemies, but we can't jump on them. We have to flip them over and then run into them. The enemies can be shell creepers, later known as Koopas, sidestepper crabs, fighter flies, and slip ice, or the fireball if you take too long. We can also use the infamous POW blocks to knock everyone over, and it's a great time waster. When it was ported to the NES, Intelligent System was in charge of the process. Based on a legendary comic strip by E.C. Cigar and released in the arcades by Nintendo and Atari, this game is interesting. We play as Popeye and our objective is to collect objects dropped by Olive Oil, while Brutus is running around trying to be a Giga Chad and choke the life out of you. Popeye is a helpless protagonist, and Les picks up a can of spinach. Then the familiar song plays and we can clock the shit out of him. It's a cool game. Let's work with HAL Labs again. It'll be fun. Ever played Joust by Williams? This is Nintendo and HAL's take on it. We play as a balloon fighter, and we float above enemies that have their own balloons. Once they pop, they fall down, we land, kick them in the face. It's a very gimmicky yet simple time waster, and on the NES, it was awesome. And on a Nintendo Versus system, where it originated, it was even more awesome. I always get a kick looking at these Nintendo arcade cabinets because it's a glimpse to how people saw the NES for the first time. And man, they look fun. Nintendo released 3 games in August of 1986. This was the first one, Gumshoe. Now I talked about this one before, namely in another Every Game Ever episode about the NES Zapper and all of the licensed games that were released. You should check it out. It's a cool episode. Maybe you'll find something that you haven't seen before. Gumshoe is a novel game. We act as a third-party protector and mobility assistant for Mr. Stevenson, who only walks to the right and can't jump unless we shoot him. True story. Our job is to collect 5 Black Panther diamonds to give to a mafia leader, King Dom, to rescue our daughter Jennifer. Much like Duck Hunt and Wild Gunman, it saw its start on the Versus system. Here's a neat one, Mach Rider. It's essentially Road Blaster from Atari with a motorcycle and guns mounted on said motorcycle, but this came out years before Road Blasters was ever an idea. This particular game was developed solely by HAL Labs and went from the Famicom to the Versus system to the NES. It takes place in 2112 and we play the Mach Rider, a guy who travels from location to location on his future bike, destroying any bad guys in the way with his gun or ramming into them from the side. In retrospect, this is sort of an advanced game. We can control Mach Rider by moving left and right with the D-pad, while the up and down arrows control the gear shift. A accelerates, and B shoots the gun. No need for brakes here, we're only going forward. There's also quite a few modes if you're into replayability. Urban Champion is the final game released in the August 1986 interval, and it's a simple fighting game. We go around fighting a guy and knocking him into a manhole after 3 rounds. The game continues until we get the rank of champion. If we run out of time, a cop shows up and arrests the player closest to being knocked off the sidewalk, which is a great strategy if you're feeling overwhelmed. Just keep him at bay. This was released for the Versus system, and I'm kind of interested in checking it out. It looks pretty neat for what it was. Now, the next 2 games were released in October of 1986 for the NES. In fact, there were 4 games released during this interval, and it's really difficult to find the exact dates, so I'm going to go off the Japanese release time for the last 2 that we're mentioning today. This one has a definitive date, however, October 29th, 1986, while the other ones, no matter how hard I search for it, I can't find a definitive date. I've checked as many Japanese websites, American websites. I even went to a Brazilian website. Couldn't find anything about him. Chubby Cherub was released in December of 1985 for Japan, and it was designed by a company that I historically hold disdain for, Tosei. Tosei almost worked exclusively with Bandai back in the early 80s, and their games are just much to be desired. Chubby Cherub was known as Kyutaro the Ghost, Bow Wow Panic, and it's based on a manga of the same name from Fujiko Fujio. The only work I recognize from him is Doraemon, which has a cult following in Japan. In the game, we play as Chubby Cherub, and our job is to rescue our friends who are kidnapped. This translates to running around as a naked kid dealing with tons of dogs that really fucking hate cherubs. And we need to dispose of them or avoid them, all the while grabbing food to keep our life force up. So to me, in some ways, this feels like a flying adventure island. It has the same mechanic. Based on a massively popular manga, and again created by Tosei, Tag Team Match Muscle belongs to the Kinnikuman franchise, and it's very rudimentary. On face value, it's a wrestling game, but in application, it's much more like a fighting game. We control one of 8 different wrestlers from the franchise, and we run up to them and either kick them or punch them. Sometimes we can grab an energy ball and even do a special move. Each character has their own. The game does have a limited number of stages though, 255 to be exact. So buckle up, it's gonna be a long career. And those are the first 30 games on the NES. What were your memories of these games as a kid? Were any of you lucky enough to crack open one of these in your youth and pop it in the NES for the first time? I would love to hear down in the comments below how you felt during that time. I do treasure those memories, and I'm sure the community would as well if given the chance to hear your story. We're extremely close to that subscriber goal as well. 4,000 is a big milestone for someone as insignificant in the scope of YouTube as I am. So I'm excited to know that I'm that close. So if you're new here, feel free to hit that subscribe button. Finally, the most important thing that you can do for me is click that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the channel and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.